Hey, good morning. Thanks to GI-TOC for having us as Ideas for Peace Foundation and all of you for your time and interest. My name is Sebastián Londoño. I'm a researcher at Ideas for Peace Foundation. And today we're going to talk about the results of a recent research we've done, and mainly because we will try to tackle some questions and challenges about the negotiation peace process with organized crime that's being held in Medellín, Colombia, and its metropolitan area by the national government. As a roundtable discussion session, we're happy to have our experts, Gina Cabarcas, co-founder and general director of Laboratorio de Justicia y Política Criminal, Juanita Durán, co-founder and technical coordinator also in Laboratorio de Justicia y Política Criminal, and Felipe Botero, our colleague from GI-TOC. What we will do is that first I will address a few words and data as context, and then I'm going to ask some questions to our colleagues, and from there begin our discussion. As context, dialogue has been the preferred mechanism by the government of President Gustavo Petro as an alternative to resolve the armed conflict in the country. Through this approach, 8 boards were opened on which the government expected to simultaneously play the boards that would lead to what was called a total peace. This total peace process can be divided into 2 categories. One involving groups that are recognized as having some political character, rebel groups, and another involving criminal organizations. This talk we're going to have and the issues we will try to tackle are linked with the process that's being led in Medellín City and its metropolitan area in a total of 10 municipalities. This process falls into the second category and, as pointed out, involves organized crime structures whose origins can be traced back to the era of Pablo Escobar. Since the late 1990s and the first half of the years 2000, these structures unified and became part of the urban armed conflict as one of the units or parts of paramilitary organization known as Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, kind of self-defense forces in Colombia. On June the 2nd of 2023, a formal dialogue table was established by the national government of President Gustavo Petro with representatives and some bosses from the organized crime groups currently imprisoned. Partially regarding homicide, our report is titled Negotiating Peace When There Is No War. And let me highlight a few important data. In 1991, Medellín was the most violent city in the world. 395.5 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. At the present time, in the top 50 list, there are 8 Colombian cities. Medellín is not even amongst those 8. And even more, Medellín is not even in the top 10 of the most violent cities in Colombia. Comparing 1991 to 2023, the reductions in homicides in Medellín is 94%. Both governments and the organized crime leaders claim credit for these positive results. In relation with the process going on and what we've called negotiating peace when there is no war, Felipe, Gina, what is your interpretation of the behavior and the progressive and sustained reduction in homicides and its correlation with organized crime?
Do you want to start, Gina, or should I start?
Start, Felipe. Go ahead.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Sebastián, for the introduction. Warm welcome to this space, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I think that what has happened in terms of homicides in Medellín has been named or identified as a miracle almost, the miracle of Medellín. And without any doubt, there is literally lives being saved the question here is why and how the homicides have reduced in the city. There are different approaches. There are different explanations. For sure, certain policies that has been implemented at the local level has had an impact. Those are policies in terms of law enforcement measure, but also in terms of crime and violence prevention that has been led by the city. We all know and hear about libraries, a lot of urban developments in the most vulnerable and violent areas of the city. But at the same time, and recently, different researchers has also identified that organized crime itself has had an impact or let's say a share of responsibility on it. And it's disagreements between organized crime groups that exist in the city who has been able to diminish violence by agreements among themselves. So what I think is interesting here is that the total peace policy is a policy that is trying to negotiate with different types of criminal groups, either political or purely criminal, as you mentioned in the context. And it's operating in different parts and geographies of the country. Medellín is one of them. But the interesting question here is what is going to happen in a context of Medellín where there are not so many homicides, considering that the total peace policy has put homicide reduction in its center. It's a policy that it's created to save lives. So in this idea of saving lives, what will happen in this context, in which there are not so much violence and there is not a lot of homicides to negotiate around. Most of my answers here comes from a research program that we do actually share with Laboratorio de Política and Justicia Criminal, represented here both by my colleagues Juanita and Gina. And we argue that total peace is being implemented in a context of a hybrid political order. This is a theoretical definition that says that besides thinking in failed states or failed institutions, there are places where governance is shared between different actors, among them criminal actors. And we are saying that total peace is being implemented in contexts where criminal actors have a share of the governance, in this case of the city. And it's a governance that is having an impact on homicides. So more than actually answering the question, I will leave or leave another question on the table, and is, will total peace be a way to institutionalize these agreements that already exist in the city? And it's interesting because negotiating with criminal groups, which is actually the name of our research program that is supported by the Serious Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Evidence research program by the University of Birmingham, considers that negotiations with or between criminal groups exist all the time. Sometimes are upfront, sometimes are hidden because of the implications. And in this case, if you take out the homicide variable for negotiation, will total peace become a way to institutionalize this type of negotiations? That will be the questions that I leave to my colleagues and that I leave to answer your questions, Sebastian.
Gina, you go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Sebastian and GI-TOC for hosting us. So I wanted to add to the question and the presentation made by Sebastian, the question of how to measure violence, right? So for sure, and definitely, what the report of FIP tells us is true. Medellín is less violent now than it was in 1991, and one form of measuring that is through homicides. However, and this is linked also on how to negotiate with criminal groups in Medellín and in other parts of Colombia, and I'm sure that this also relates to other contexts in the region. Is so when we're negotiating to reduce violence, are we asking to reduce homicides, and is that all that we're asking the groups to do? So in the Laboratorio, we've tried to open up the question of how to measure violence, and we've come up with the idea that is also developed by many many academics here in Colombia and elsewhere, which is to introduce or try to explain homicide in something broader, which are patterns of violence, and how patterns of violence tell us something about many types of crimes, right? So in the case of Medellín and other cities in Colombia, homicide is the result of a pattern of violence that starts with extortion, with threats, in which what is happening is that for many people in these cities controlled by criminal groups, the city is not less violent. Maybe there are less homicides, but not necessarily a city that is less violent. So here the question would be, and again, as Felipe did, maybe here what we're trying is to add complexity to the question is how to negotiate with criminal groups that perpetrate patterns of violence where homicide is a result of those patterns, and to keep thinking and complexing the example of Medellín, for example. We could say, okay, these criminal groups nowadays control illegal economies that are very violent. For example, sexual exploitation of children, right, and of women. So then, yes, Medellín is less violent for sure, and this is good because this has been good for the economy, for certain parts of Medellín, for tourism. But maybe it's not less violent for some parts of Medellín, for certain barrios in Medellín, and it's definitely not less violent in certain illegal economies. And I'm just gonna mention that example, which is sexual exploitation. Thank you, Sebastián.
Talking about those patterns of violence that Gina, you just mentioned, it brings into the scene this discussion about consolidation of criminal control, criminal governance. This reduction in homicides is fundamental for analyzing security issues that, as you said, is insufficient. And what data indicates is that in the case of Medellín and its metropolitan area, all 10 municipalities, this reduction in homicidal violence is accompanied by the deepening of criminal governance. In a recent paper, Professors Bladman, Lessing, Duncan, and Tobon stated that, and let me quote, in Medellín, virtually every low and middle income neighborhood in the city is also occupied by one or more than 350 small gangs called combos. And most combos engage in at least some governance activities. This includes prohibiting and punishing property crime, settling disputes between neighbors, enforcing rules, and in exchange, taxing locals. That's the quote. In other terms, that taxing locals is also extortion. Felipe and Gina and Juanita, once again, thinking about the idea of negotiating peace when there is no war, that's not the same that less violence or not violence at all, and the contrast between reduction in homicides and the deepening of criminal governance. Felipe, what are the challenges or opportunities in relation to organized crime in this scenario?
That's a very good question, Sebastián, and I think the answer comes around the word incentives. And I'm gonna again use this research as an example. It is not based in Medellín, but what we have been able to identify in other 3 different areas: Arauca, Buenaventura, which is a process, let's say, similar to the urban process that is being held in Medellín, and Tumaco, is that in all of the scenarios, first, homicides have reduced, but other expressions of violence have increased. And I think Juanita perhaps will go deeper in that later, but in Buenaventura, we have seen an increase in disappearances. So we don't have the number of homicides, but people are being disappeared. in the other three scenarios, or in the other three cases, we have seen, as you mentioned, extortion rising. And I say incentives because, and we will go in this later, but if you go in the total peace policy under the negotiation path or the criminal submission path, there are different outcomes. And what we have seen is that some of the actors that are not clearly invested in one of the two paths are trying or are pursuing to get a more political status through increasing their political authority or legitimacy on communities. And this is basically criminal governance. What we argue is that total peace is being implemented in hybrid political orders because these actors provide security. And for example, ELN says in Arauca that they're providing security against FARC dissidents, or in Buenaventura, depending on the neighborhood that you are located, one of the factions can say it's providing security against the state or the other faction. Something similar happened in rural areas of Tumaco where dissident groups are fighting. So they already claim that they're providing security. But they are also increasing political representation, and they do it first through authority. They keep solving problems. They keep doing or imposing justice in their own ways. We know that both in Tumaco and in Arauca, they're imposing punishments or enforced punishments to people that do not follow rules. They are creating rules, and they're even increasing their political representation, getting more involved in civil society organizations like Junta de Acción Comunal, as is the case of Arauca, where they are also trying to control this participation space. And finally, they're also providing welfare. And what do I mean by welfare? They're creating or developing infrastructure. They're bringing to the negotiation table, as is the case of Buenaventura. And Juanita has an expression that I really like, which is, if we will need to name or to put names on the negotiation tables in Quibdó will be named hunger. So they're bringing these welfare needs of population to conversations that criminals are not normally involved in. So first, this focus on homicide is for increasing violence and increasing ways of imposing criminal governance, as is extortion. And second, the incentive to go to a more political pathway, it's moving, or we found that is generating incentives in organized crime groups to create more control or to generate more control to have better outcomes on the negotiation scenarios that they are participating in it.
Juanita, trying to link the incentives Felipe just mentioned, this highlights a question about, in a certain way, not democratic, but a peaceful equilibrium. What can you share with us about that equilibrium and the challenge for state and policy design and policy makers debates?
Thank you, Sebastian and Felipe. Yes, I think that's a very interesting issue because there is a challenge that is very significant in context as Medellín, but I would say other parts of the region. And there is a kind of trade-off between the monopoly of governance and violence. And as was said before, for example, in Medellín, one can describe the scenario that they are living right now as a balance in which there is little violence or less violence, especially homicidal violence, as Gina was pointing out. But the cost is that the state shares the government and huge pieces of governance in the city. So it's the government of the city shares the provision of justice, for example, shares the provision of security, shares taxing, as Felipe was describing. And it's very difficult because sometimes criminal groups are in a way better than the state providing those services. For example, they can be faster. It is obviously faster to provide justice when you don't have a procedure. It's not that it's
best justice, but it can be easier, it can be quickly. So
And more effective.
Yeah, that's like the trade-off. And the dilemma is how you can recover parts of that governance without without creating incentives or triggering violence in the city. And that's more delicate in cities as Medellin, in which, Medellin is having right now, so in a year, the homicides they had in a weekend or in 2 weekends 30 years ago. So it's not easy to explain, like, we need to recover governance when they know how violence, how do you feel when you have like exacerbated violence. So I would say that like in this negotiation, I agree with Felipe that the negotiation has increased criminal governance in like consolidated in some parts of the city, in the country, but at the same time is a strategy to recover parts, like marginally recovering parts of the governance of the city in different areas, and like, but without putting on the table how we can do that without increasing violence. We still don't want to increase homicides, but we need to recover bits of governance. But of course, talking about governance is very abstract, and it's very difficult to balance it with homicides on the other side. But I would say that that's what is kind of at stake, and I feel that even if the process is not successful, if it doesn't not finish with an agreement, not an agreement, but without the submission of the groups, it's very valuable that the government was able like to put that balance on the table. And it's gonna be very important if there is not a successful result. It's gonna be very important how to finish this negotiation table, like without breaking the balance, and and trying to find a way to
without
maintain.
breaking that equilibrium.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
To advance in that governance recovery, but also for the process negotiation itself, the legal framework on which the negotiations are based requires further development. And I'm talking about this process in particular. For some analysts, that should be the enabling element, but others argue that the legal framework should not be one of the major concerns, or not at least at this point. The question is it or should be the legal framework the starting point or part of that end point and at the agreements? Is that the discussion about legal framework that important in Medellin's case, Gina? What do you think?
Thank you, Sebastian. So one of the things that the total peace policy has put forward in Colombia is the question if we have enough legal framework or enough laws to regulate these type of negotiations, right? And in Colombia, and I think that this may be something that's particular to Colombia and some other Latin American countries, but that in other regions is not the case. And it's that we make everything legal. We try to make every policy problem a legal problem, and a problem of not having enough laws or enough legal framework to develop the policy. And I think that with the total peace policy, it's not an exception. We're doing that also. However, this also has a broader context, and I think a more regional and I would say worldwide context, which is if there is a legal framework, both national or transnational. This is something that Felipe has pointed out before, if we have the framework to actually negotiate with violent criminal groups, right? So I think that the question you're raising puts forward like two different problems. One is if there's a need of legal and I would say a legitimate framework to negotiate with violent criminal groups, and the other, which is more more specific for Colombia, which is for this case in particular, we need further legal development to actually conduct the peace negotiation, to actually conduct the negotiations with these criminal groups, for example, the ones in Medellín. And there, I would try and answer those questions with different ideas. The first one is that in Colombia, negotiating with violent criminal groups has not been something that has been taught theoretically. This actually has happened before. And Medellín is a good example of this because there has been negotiations with criminal groups such as the Cartel de Medellín back in 1991. And the thing is that these negotiations that have happened before have had different characteristics and outcomes. And I think the problem has been more than if there's a legal framework or not, is if we have reflected enough about these processes. And in part we haven't, because these processes are usually unknown, they're secretly conducted, or even publicly denied, or both, right? So part of the challenge, and here the Institute for Integrated Transitions published in 2021 a report precisely on that, on what the unknown negotiations or the negotiations with criminal groups that had happened around the world. They documented over 24 negotiations with criminal groups, and what they're trying to do is precisely to reflect on how they were done and what can we learn from them. And the other two things I would say is that I don't believe that we need a new legal reform to actually conduct the negotiations, but what we need is, and we have plenty of room for this, we need to develop a framework with the existing laws to conduct those negotiations in a legitimate way with organized crime, and a legitimate way that can be measured and can be evaluated. And the other issue I would like to raise is the other problem of this legal framework is even if we have the pre-existing law, if we have the criminal justice system, is the criminal justice system ready to actually respond to this need of having an alternative for dismantling criminal groups, right? So can the judicial system, the ordinary judicial system, and not necessarily a transitional justice system, can the ordinary judicial system respond to the need to actually dismantle groups that are big, right? The criminal justice system ordinarily deals with criminal groups in an individual basis, right? They target individuals and put individuals to that process. And what we are asking the criminal justice system in the cases of negotiations with criminal groups is to respond to those to that need of surrendering, or as Felipe said, like to presenting to justice a whole group of around, it would be hundreds of individuals or thousands of individuals at the same time, right? So to sum up the answer to your question, I would say we don't need necessarily a new legal framework. What we need is to develop our current framework and to develop it in a way that the negotiations with criminal groups can be both legitimate and can be practically done. And by practically done, I'm specifically referring to how the criminal justice system can respond to that need of surrendering a group of hundreds of thousands of individuals.
Juanita, I know you have deeply studied this that Gina pointed out. And do you think, is this something kind of unique or at least striking in Colombia's legal and political tradition? I mean, like to get stuck or to think mainly in this legal component than other issues around these kind of processes?
Well, so I agree a lot with what Gina said. In Colombia, we love to transform policy problems in legal problems. But that's especially true for like legal frameworks in negotiation. That happened with Justicia y Paz when we were negotiating with paramilitary groups, and also with FARC when we were creating the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. And the discussion was very wide, and then there was an intervention of the Constitutional Court, and there's been like lots of papers about that. And so that's something that happened before, and that also a consequence of that is that now we have lots of standards, jurisprudence, rules, decrees that are part of like the legal body we need to sort out to go through this process. But that also has created some expectations. You know, it's like there's always the discussion of that. So now, for example, what FARC negotiated is a minimum that, or we need to go from that to other, but that's a whole different jurisdiction. So I think that's one bit of the problem. The other part is, as Gina said, this has happened before in Colombia, but I would say there's something different, and is that in Total Peace, we took this idea of negotiating with criminal groups to the frame we've been using to negotiate with rebel groups. So now we are both, those are, we think, like kind of the same legal framework. So one new part of that discussion is how can we, first, do we need to distinguish procedures for those two groups, or we can do, because what is interesting is what is behind this is that the government said, like, negotiations should be carried out, should take place with all those groups that produce violence. We need all violence producers to do something with them. But now the discussion is, how do we need to distinguish the groups? Do we need to distinguish, for example, the tools we have to negotiate with one and with the other? The judicial system needs to be different. We need to do. We need different rules to manage detentions or arrests in one case or in the other. So I think that's also a part of the discussion, which also has behind this idea of, is the same a criminal group that, you know, is so close to the criminal market, and is the same that a rebel group that has a more altruist idea, an idea of how should the country and the government should be. So I think that's all part of this discussion about the legal framework. In a way, it's also a political discussion of how we see violence and producers of violence.
This brings, Juanita, another discussion. Is we're talking broadly about something like negotiating with crime. In both cases, if they are kind of political actors or purely criminal actors. But you said, do we need to distinguish every actor that generates violence? But I would also add, do we need to bring them all into negotiation processes? Because some argue that alternatives should be considered to addressing organized crime, and others believe that instead of exploring alternatives, the focus should be on strengthening criminal justice system, police, judicial, and penitentiary capacities, which have proven to be insufficient. So, what the discussion may highlight is a fundamental issue within as foundation Ideas for Peace Foundation, that is an issue of regional and international interest, and is raising the question of how to engage with organized crime beyond the usual reliance on police and judicial prosecution. Do you believe this process offers the conditions to ask how willingly are we in Colombia, Latin America in particular, to build negotiation models with organized crime, and on what terms? Or shouldn't it be a process of negotiation, but of strengthening state capacities to enforce law? Felipe also, and Gina, feel free to
Do you
intervene.
want to go first?
You go ahead, Juanita.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. So I would say two things. First, Colombia is, of course, as the region, very divided on the view of that what should happen here. Some people thinks we need to engage in a military response to violence and to criminal markets, but there's also a part of the country which thinks that negotiation is the best path. But I would say I personally have a very cliche answer here. I think it's impossible to concentrate only in one of those paths. In a way, you need both. I think it's a great it's a very good opportunity to consider negotiation for at least a couple of reasons. First, as Felipe was saying, what we found in our research is even those groups that are very, very close to criminal markets have a political view and have political needs and living contexts in which there are very basic needs that are not satisfied. And in a way, they are answering to that, even in a very basic way. I would love to study or have a job, but I cannot. I only have the criminal market to go. So in a way, all that criminal groups have at least in a way some views on this. So I think that's interesting. Up to what point this total peace can address in bits of that. But the other part is we are not great in the military and prosecutorial response. We've been doing this for years, and we have moderate results to show. So I think it's impossible about it's a good way, but also we need the prosecutorial and the military and the other response because we need to have red lines, limits, points in which we say no. I cannot negotiate if this is happening. If we are in a table talking about how to transit to peace, and you are killing indigenous leaders, or I'm going to use the other response. So I think in a way it's difficult to find in which case we should be using one or the other, but I think in a way we need to have both.
Felipe,
Gina has a
yeah, you go ahead, Gina.
I wanted to add some things, and actually because there are already questions in our chat, but I wanted to add a couple of things. I completely agree. Part of the problem is that maybe you don't have to choose between one or the other, between strengthening law enforcement or negotiating. You can combine both. But I actually think that the example of what happened when with the peace talks with FARC kind of shows why it is important to mix the two, right? So the question that was raised was if we could elaborate on when the FARC left, what happened that other groups tried and how they posed the question exactly is, could you please address how the more recent negotiations with the FARC opened up spaces for organized crime groups to take over areas previously controlled by the FARC, right? And yeah, so that's an example of why it is important to mix the two. And I'm gonna tell you that with an example. So in Nariño, we're also doing work for Nariño, where there's also peace negotiations with criminal groups. And one of the things that happened was that when the FARC left, other groups came and took power, right? And so the easier answer is no. The state could not cover that void of governance left by FARC. The more complex answer is that we did not strengthen the state that we had to strengthen, right? And I was actually in Nariño this weekend, and one of the authorities of the indigenous communities in this part of Colombia, what he told me was the problem was that we thought that the state in Bogota was going to fill up that void. But what we had to do was to make sure that the indigenous communities, the communitaries, governments that work in those regional areas where the conflict is right now could have enough power to actually fill the void of those criminal groups. So what I would add to the answer that Juanita gave was that the conflict has changed. We no longer have a national conflict. We have regional conflicts. And in those regional conflicts, the question is not if we can fill the void left by the criminal groups with the central state, with Bogota, but if we can actually strengthen the state that works there, the communities that work there, that have power to govern there, and with that, we can actually fill the void left by those criminal groups.
For all three of you, Juanita mentioned a military intervention as one of the approaches that, like at the end of a continued line, having negotiation in the other. Yeah, and she suggests that we should not be in those extremes, but kind of in the middle. If not military, but thinking about strengthening that prosecution and criminal justice, and Felipe, and I'll throw it back to you. You mentioned earlier a discussion about incentives. If not military, but strengthening prosecution, could it raise like the incentive to use the violence in some groups and organizations to get a better treatment and increase that use of violence to achieve a better treatment in a context as Medellin? Being said, not military intervention. I think that's not the context. Not in the other extreme negotiation, but strengthening judiciary and prosecution could bring into the table incentives for those groups to increase violence and try to get a better treatment.
Sebastian, I'm gonna do a mix here, and I'm gonna return to the previous question, because we normally tend to see what happened in Colombia as the belly bottom of the world, and we Colombians believe that we are the only conflict and the only reality, but we are embedded in a more global scenario too. And I will bring the incentives logic again. And let's start with the international law and especially international humanitarian law. There are no incentives for negotiation. There are no clear pathways. There are no clear ideas in how to promote negotiation. Basically, in more than 560 treaties that exist in different topics from human rights, biodiversity, whatever we consider, none of them has clear lines in how to move with negotiations, both for conflicts or for criminal groups. When we go to criminal groups, it's even less. The UNTOC, which is the main treaty, does not even consider negotiation. It believes in military responses. It believes in law enforcement responses. It says that the states need to control, the need to respond. And this is problematic because this is already creating a bias against negotiation. What is also interesting here is that Colombia, for a long term, has been pushing that boundary in the international law. Because as Gina, Juanita mentioned already, we have been promoting negotiation both with rebel groups and with criminal groups, as we did it with Cartel de Medellín in the 90s. But and I will try to go to the first question that Gina mentioned, and it's what happened with FARC after 2016. This differentiation between I am a rebel group or I am a pure subversive group and I'm a pure criminal group is completely blurred. It has changed the logic of the conflict in the country, not only in terms of the regionality that Gina already mentioned. There are like different countries in different regions with different levels of intensity and different approaches, but also there are different type of actors that all of them are involved with criminal markets. And Gina, if I could add something to your answer, it was not only a lack of strengthening of the state, but that we negotiate with a rebel group that operated in places where criminal markets are rampant and are very, very lucrative. And if the state do not take control of this, another criminal actor has all the incentive to go and take it. And that's actually what happened. And that's why it allowed opportunities not only to other criminal groups, but also to dissident groups from the same FARC to remain in the same regions and actually try to control criminal economies. And I believe that what is happening right now, acknowledging that you can negotiate, it's literally a laboratory. It's a why not? Let's try. Let's see if we can complement other measures, and let's see if we can also push that international bias against negotiation. And I like your example, Jean, about what is going on in Nariño, and we have discussed this a lot in our research project. And is if we're operating hybrid political orders, besides the national government or the formal government and the criminals, there are other authorities as communities. And Sebastian, this takes me to your question. And sorry, I'm doing circles and trying to connect everything. But for example, what can we learn of what already exists at the local level to be included in the negotiation? If right now it's a criminal government or a criminal actor who is providing justice, what can we learn from indigenous justice practices? Or what can we even learn from the provision of justice from criminal groups? How we make alternative judiciary measures that actually solve people's problem and actually bring another type of states. I think this is what is on the table right now, and this is the opportunity right now. If it's not law enforcement or negotiation, we should focus in justice provision, but we literally need to learn from what is going on locally.
For Juanita and Gina, because I think we should be closing our discussion briefly. Do you think that this Colombian process, and in particular this process in Medellin, can help to move in a different direction, maybe in terms of what Felipe is suggesting, like in the middle, but trying to push forward and remove some boundaries in relation to how to tackle organized crime, in particular in urban contexts?
Ani, do you want to go first and I can complement?
No, if you want to go, and maybe I can finish with the other question we have from the public.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Okay. So So what I would say is that definitely we are pushing the boundaries of what the alternatives are to to deal with organized criminal groups, with violent organized criminal groups. And we are pushing those boundaries both in terms of how can we do a legitimate negotiation process with criminal groups. And I think we've pointed out to several things during this session. One is that that the legal framework is not enough, that we legal frameworks are welcome to actually give the negotiation some sort of legal ground, but that we need more for those negotiations to actually be legitimate. And that legitimacy comes from actually implementing the laws that are available, and also building on why having that negotiation doesn't only mean doing favors to the criminal groups, but it means building a better way of life for those communities that suffer the violence of those, the violence and the criminal governance of those groups. And so in that sense, the other thing I would mention is that we also have to push boundaries in something that, at least for Latin American countries that have a more, that are not as Anglo-Saxon as the States and as England and etc., which is that we have to have a criminal justice system that can actually negotiate with organized crime, right? And that talks about how plea bargainings and so in Latin America we call this opportunity principle, the principio oportunidad. How can we use those legal tools that we have in the criminal justice system to actually negotiate with organized crime? And it also talks, and this is the other boundary I think we definitely have to push, which is how is the prison system going to respond to this, right? Because if we have, if the criminal justice system is the one that should have an answer for those negotiations, for that opportunity for criminal groups to surrender to justice, if the answer is everyone has to go to prison, we are going to, the prison system would collapse more than it has already collapsed. So the other place where we think we have to push boundaries is what is the alternative to prison. And that alternative to prison has to work for serious organized crime as well. So we have to push boundaries in all sorts of areas, in how the negotiation is legitimate, how we have a response from the criminal justice system that's appropriate for groups that are made up of many individuals, and how we do come up with a different solution from prison. I would say that.
Juanita, and for everyone, let me to read the question that you would like to answer. And the question is, don't you think that strengthening LEAs takes decades while negotiating should be faster and will create a better path for developing capacities of rule of law in a more peaceful environment?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I think that I would say like two things. First is that, well, of course, if you have the chance to choose, of course, negotiation is it's in a lot of ways like a better path, because of course you are building the solution with the groups, with the community, with the victims, and of course that can give you a better result, a result that is that stays in time for a longer time, and you also like promote ways or better law enforcement frequently involves a lots of violence as well. Of course, it's a violence that comes from the state, but it's still violence, and citizens are in the middle of it, and in some cases, it can also be difficult to live with a strong answer from the state when we are trying to recover like that governance and everything. For example, in Colombia, we have had like a very significant history of human rights violations that come from the state. So that's part of strengthening law enforcement sometimes. But I think that something that is not true is that negotiation is faster, or better, negotiation can be fast, but implementing negotiations can be that also takes decades. And I think that that's like a lesson learned for Colombia, and having like being conscious about that is very important, like for expectations, and to value if a process is successful or is not successful, and what takes so much time. So like the justice solutions take a lot of time to get implemented. We've been doing Justicia y Paz since like 2000 and a bit, like from
2006.
2006, and we've been doing Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz since 2016, and it's, for example, la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz is supposed to solve the FARC conflict in 20 years. And we now know that's a very short time, but also like recovering communities and building governance capacity with local authorities also takes time. So I would say that, of course, I personally prefer negotiation over any other way of solving a crime, but that takes a lot of time, and that takes a lot of effort as well. Yeah.
I would like to add something, and I think that we should be closing. Legitimate organized crime, organized crime can get legitimacy from that provision of goods and services, such as solving neighbor problems and others. And we can agree on that. But what should not be taken out of the equation is that most effective solutions can be done by these organized crime organizations, because they don't have to bring in those costs that I think we should be willingly to accept. And those are the ones that Juanita pointed out as human rights and democratic procedures. Let's say it's a more efficient justice, nobody doubts it, but that effectiveness is also a result of a violent control and a non-democratic control. And in between military and prosecution initiatives, I think we should not take that, because we can be tempted to think that criminal governance that is really effective and should make way to a context or a path in the one that the state can, as the person who has mentioned, create a better path for developing capacities. It could be that in the process of bringing justice and taxation or extortion, those groups also build legitimacy, and that will be something to take into account.
Felipe?
I wasn't sure if it was a question or more Sebastian kind of wrap up, but I do agree, Sebastian. One of the let's say, one of the challenges or that we are facing with this, and with we mean the country taking the decision of negotiating, is how you do not legitimize what criminal actors have been doing. Because, and this is also a conversation we have had internally in the research team with Juanita, and is they're legitimate because they're still carrying an AK-47. If you take the weapon out of the criminal actor, maybe they will not be the one actually providing the justice or the welfare. And I mean, there is a violence structure behind that kind of support that legitimacy. And then is why we need to consider other avenues. And this is why justice and transitional justice should be part of the conversation in any of the scenarios. And sometimes this division between I'm a political actor that can go to transitional justice, or I am a purely criminal that I will just go into the current laws, should consider our ways, because we cannot forget, first, the history and what those criminal actors has done in the country. Second, we cannot forget victims. There are a lot of victims around that have suffered from the actions of those criminal actors. And even though we are claiming in our research that we need to actually learn to what is going on and what works locally, it doesn't mean that we simply need to go and say, yeah, we're going to share the governance from now on, and you, criminal actor, are now a legitimized institutional player in the game. Why not? It can be, but certain aspects needs to be convened. You know, are you going to respond to justice? Are you going to respond, or how are you going to restore your victims? Or are you going to take responsibility of what you have done? I'm not really sure if this answered the question, but listening to you, that were my feelings at the time, and is how do we manage to actually promote negotiations, save lives, reduce homicides, actually reduce violence, but at the same time come out with a structure that first avoid what happened or what has happened already, and we have seen recycle of violence after the paramilitary negotiations and the mobilization, and then after FARC. And we found this when we were doing fieldwork in Arauca. People were saying, if we do not bring people from Arauca locally from the ELN to the negotiation, we are going to get DCS right here in the department. No, this is what our sources said, and is what can we learn from those previous processes for this new process, and how we create. And I like what Gina said a while ago. How we think theoretically this, and how we push boundaries locally, meaning the country, but also internationally. And I will leave it because I know that Gina will have a more smart answer or comment to your point, Sebastian.
No, I not smarter. I just want to add something else, which is, I think that what Sebastian is pointing out is a huge challenge for negotiating with organized crime, which is what is the ultimate end game of negotiating with organized crime. When you negotiate with rebel groups, when you negotiate with insurgent groups, the ultimate goal is for those groups to become a political party, right? To become a political actor without arms, without weapons. But with criminal groups, even though they have certain components of criminal governance, what is the ultimate end game? The ultimate end game is not to make them become a political party. The ultimate end game, when you negotiate with criminal groups, what is it? Is to build more state, is to add to the state formation. But what does that leave for the criminal group? What does the criminal group become? So I think that Sebastian, you're right that it's a huge challenge. What is the ultimate end game in negotiations with organized crime? What is the picture of those groups after the negotiation? What do we want from that?
As we have, I think, 2 minutes left, let me bring a new question for the three of you. In the Medellín case, in a recent decentralized Congress session, the delegates of bosses of this organized crime in negotiation regarding the agenda said that repairing victims was part of the agenda, but haven't said specifically in which terms. And also the government haven't published officially the agenda of what is being negotiated. Should this topic about victims and the roles and social society in the process, but mainly victims' roles, should it be on top of the table from the very beginning? It may seem obvious, but it's not that much, because some said that it could create more problems in terms of the discussion processes. So many things that those roles and terms in which victims are going to be repaired should be at the end point of the program. What do you think? Should it be on top of the table from the very beginning?
I can start if you want, but what I would say, Sebastian, is, well, I don't have an answer, obviously, but two points. First, I think that the challenge the government is facing is that how easy the negotiation tables should be, because of course, if you include victims or some organization of victims from the beginning, the conversation is going to be more difficult, and it's going to be difficult to advance in every step, because of course it's a more complex conversation. But even I know that is difficult, and what I think it's one should try to find an arrangement to balance that. But I think that something that is important is not to make the negotiations tables too comfortable for parties, because democracy is very complex and includes those voices and includes the voices you don't want to hear. And of course, when you are an armed organization, it's very easy to silence those voices that you don't want to hear, but that's exactly what you will have in democracy. So I think that making those negotiation tables uncomfortable is part of showing what democracy is about, and how what you need to consider in those groups. For example, some groups have been in some territories for a long time. They are kind close and work together with some communities, not in all cases, but in some cases. But of course, there's kind of they don't want to hear even that other people, or that people saying, no, it's been really tough on us. We would have preferred something else, not an ARP group providing that justice that you provide for me. Maybe I didn't want it, but I had no choice. So I think that's part of it's the difficult part of the conversation. And even if you need to think how to advance, you also need to being careful about not making it very comfortable. But also there are international and national standards about what should be the role of the victims in the transition to peace, and what are the rights. And so I think that that's a very big part of the conversation, and that's very different today from what it was from, for example, when Colombia was negotiating with the M19, the group that had a negotiation in the 90s. At that moment, victims' rights was not an issue. But today, we have lots of international and national standards, and we need to take them in account. So I would say that's at least two bits of information to consider in that question.
Sebastian, just to add one more thing to the answer, which is very short, which is something these processes have, which is that you have to distinguish between victims, communities, and that there are many heterogeneous groups in that sector, right? So including this in the negotiation table or in the negotiation process is obviously going to be demanding, and I completely agree with Juanita. But I just wanted to add that is very useful to distinguish between groups of victims and communities.
Communities.
Mhm.
Felipe, something else to add?
Very quickly, I think we should consider this negotiation locally, and with the time passing, I consider more and more the local logic of it, and I think the word here is transition. And Gina was saying was the ultimate goal of negotiating with criminal groups. Maybe what we should be discussing here is how we transit from a very criminal governance logic to an institutionalized way, in which for sure victims should be considered and should be in the center of the conversation, as well as other things related to local context and to local realities. The role of communities, as Gina was saying, the role of more ancestral and traditional way of justice, and all of these should be issues that should create the dialogue, that should make the dialogue and take us to an exit, to an end goal, which is how we do transform this local reality, considering all the local actors involved.